The economic emergency caused by the COVID-19 pandemic has only just begun. That's according to Chancellor Rishi Sunak, who delivered his public spending review today and also gave us an update about the state of the economy. Coming up in this video, everything you need to know about the public spending review, what it means for the economy, what it means for your money. Hi everyone, I'm Martin Bamford, a chartered financial planner at Informed Choice, and in this video I'm taking a look at today's public spending review announced in the House of Commons earlier today by Chancellor Rishi Sunak. I'm afraid it makes for fairly grim reading or watching in this case. We are in the worst economic downturn in over 300 years here in the UK, inspired by the COVID-19 pandemic of course, and part of the public spending review announcement today in the House of Commons was the latest economic forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR. Now, the OBR are the government's independent forecasters when it comes to these matters, and they believe that the size of the UK economy will shrink by 11.3% this year as a whole, and perhaps more importantly, they believe it will take until the end of 2022 before the size of the economy recovers to its pre-pandemic level. As a result, the amount of government borrowing needed to keep the economy afloat is going to surge to its highest ever peacetime level. There were also some fairly grim predictions when it came to rising unemployment. The OBR now believes there's going to be a peak unemployment level of 2.6 million people. That means unemployment is going to rise to 7.6%. Now, it's worth noting that that unemployment prediction is not quite as bad as it was back in the summer, so they have tempered their expectations a little bit, but it is still going to be the worst level of unemployment we've seen here in the UK for quite some time. Addressing the economic emergency, as the Chancellor is calling it, he said that's why we have taken and continue to take extraordinary measures to protect people's jobs and incomes. But on that subject of jobs and income, there was pretty bad news for members of the public sector. We'd already heard about this in the weekend press and it came to light in today's public spending review. There is going to be a public sector pay freeze next year for everybody in the public sector, with the exception of frontline NHS workers and low-paid members of the public sector. So this means that around 1 million frontline NHS workers will get a pay rise next year, but other members of the NHS won't, and also around 2.4 million lower paid public sector workers are in line for a pay rise. Lower paid as in earning less than the median income of £24,000 a year. Those members of the public sector guaranteed a pay rise next April of at least £250. Now, there's around 5.5 million public sector workers in the UK. The Chancellor pointed out that the majority of them will receive a pay rise next year, but it does mean that a couple of million people in the public sector won't receive a pay rise, or in fact will receive a pay cut next year in real terms once price inflation has been taken into account. Price inflation is still rising. It's well below the Bank of England's target of 2%, but it is making goods and services more expensive. So if your pay doesn't go up next year, one of those 2 million people in the public sector with a pay freeze next year, effectively it's a pay cut because everything you're going out to buy is becoming more expensive. Sunak said that he cannot justify a significant across-the-board pay rise for all public sector workers in the current circumstances. Instead, we are targeting our resources at those who need it the most. For people working in the private sector, the national minimum wage will go up in April next year. It's going to rise by 2.2% or 19 pence to reach £8.91 per hour. Now, that 2.2% rise in the national minimum wage is lower than the 6% recommended by the Low Pay Commission, who recommended the government increase it by 6% next April. However, they made their recommendation at the end of last year, so pre-pandemic, and their view has changed since, so they've revised down that recommendation. They expressed concern that a national minimum wage increase that was too high would damage employers unnecessarily and also cost more jobs. So Rishi Sunak keen to point out that on average the national minimum wage rise next year would mean a full-time worker on that national minimum wage would earn £345 a year more as a result of the rise. Rishi Sunak pointing out that as a result of that national minimum wage increase from April, the average full-time worker on the national minimum wage would earn £345 a year more because of that 2.2% rise. He said compared to 2016, when the policy was first introduced, that's a pay rise of over £4,000. Another big headline grabber today is that the UK is going to break its commitment to spend 0.7% of national income on overseas development aid. It's going to reduce that commitment to 0.5%, saving the government some £4 billion a year. But Rishi Sunak was keen to point out that that is a temporary reduction from 0.7 to 0.5%, and the government's ambition is to get it back up to that original level, which is currently set in law. So the law is going to have to change to reduce that overseas development aid budget down to 0.5% of national income. He also explained that by spending 0.5% of national income next year, 2021, it means the UK will be donating £10 billion to overseas aid. That makes it the second biggest donor in the G7 group of countries, so still a significant amount of overseas aid being paid from the UK. Now, one fairly significant measure announced in the public spending review today that probably won't make quite as many headlines is that there's going to be a change in the calculation methodology for a common form of price inflation. That's the Retail Prices Index, or RPI. And the methodology is going to change in the year 2030, so we've still got nearly a decade to go before that happens. And it's going to come into line with a different form of inflation, the Consumer Prices Index, including housing costs, or CPIH. And this is important because CPIH, the way that's calculated, tends to be marginally lower than RPI, Retail Price Index. And it means the rate of inflation applied, for example, to defined benefit pension schemes in payment will be lower from 2030 onwards. Also, the investment return that investors get on index-linked gilts, that will be lower too. Typically, CPIH is about 0.8% lower than RPI in a given year. The gap is actually a bit narrower than that at the moment. We're in such a low inflation environment that there's very little gap. But on average, it tends to be about 0.8% lower. It's good news if you have a student loan, because the interest rate you pay on your student loan is made by reference to RPI, so that will be lower in the future. And also good for commuters, because the regulated rail fare increases are also linked to that RPI methodology, which will be lower in the future from 2030. But I don't think that one will grab as many headlines as some of the other measures. Now, there was good news also for people in receipt of their state pension, and that is the state pension triple lock is going to be maintained for April. There was a bit of speculation that that triple lock, which gives you an increase in your state pension each year of the higher of earnings inflation, or 2.5%. Some fear that that would be removed because it's becoming too expensive, too unaffordable. Now, sadly, the reason it's not being removed is because it's becoming more affordable, and that's because, as the Office for Budget Responsibility announced today, they are seeing more than expected in the way of excess deaths amongst pensioners. So more pensioners than expected are dying, largely because of COVID-19, and that's reducing the cost to a treasury of maintaining that triple lock guarantee. Back in July, back in the summer, the OBR forecast there would be 62,000 excess pensioner deaths this tax year, this fiscal year. They're now revising that forecast up to 90,000 excess pensioner deaths for the 2020-2021 fiscal year. And that's going to save the Treasury an approximately £0.6 billion, up from its original forecast of £0.5 billion. So that cost saving allowing them to maintain the state pension triple lock for at least another year. Turning back to the economy then, so Rishi Sunak today explained that the government has spent this year £280 billion on shoring up the economy in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that next year it already plans to spend an additional £55 billion to create new jobs and to keep the economy going. Now, what was particularly interesting about these ginormous amounts of public borrowing is that how cheaply the government is now able to borrow. It has an average borrowing cost which has fallen to 0.32%, and borrowing costs for the government have fallen significantly this year again. So the government's able to borrow very cheaply. The cost of servicing its public public debt is very low indeed, much lower than was forecast earlier this year, even with all the extra spending. So a good position for the UK government to be in, for the Treasury to be in, able to borrow very cheaply and finance its way through this recession. All of that borrowing will, of course, have to be repaid at some point, but the message from today, from this public spending review, is it doesn't have to be repaid just yet. We're still in borrow and spend mode. We're not in recover through higher taxes mode just yet. That will come. Best guess is that higher taxes and new tax policy will come at some point next year, depending, of course, on the path of the pandemic. But there were more spending announcements today, more investment announcements today in this public spending review, including a pledge of £349 billion this year for infrastructure investing. That's equivalent to 19% of GDP. And the announcement of the creation of a new national infrastructure bank, that's set to launch next spring. It's going to be headquartered up in the northeast of England, and it's going to work alongside the private sector to finance some new investment projects in all parts of the UK. And that national infrastructure bank is going to replace, post the Brexit transition period at the end of this year, the UK's participation in the European Infrastructure Bank. So once we're free of the European Union, this new National Infrastructure Bank will take on the UK's participation in that existing bank. And it follows last week's announcement from Boris Johnson about a 10-point green industrial revolution plan. It all forms part of that same strategy. The government apparently is hoping the plan will mobilise £12 billion and potentially 3 times as much from the private sector in order to create and support 250,000 green jobs. So the hope here is that public sector money will attract private sector investment, and it will have a multiplying effect, and more money will be available to invest in green infrastructure. And speaking today about this new National Infrastructure Bank, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak said, "Our capital plans will invest in the greener future we promised, delivering the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for climate change. We're making this country a scientific superpower with almost £50 billion for research and development. And we're publishing today a comprehensive new national infrastructure strategy. To help us finance these plans, we will establish a new UK infrastructure bank." There was also the announcement today of a new £3 billion restart programme that will be spent over the next 3 years. It's designed to help the 1 million people who have been out of work for longer than a year, so help them back into employment. And that money will be delivered via the Department for Work and Pensions, so more news on that one to come shortly too. But as I said earlier, no nasty surprises when it came to taxation. There's been a lot of speculation over the past few days that we may see a raid on pensions, higher rate tax relief on contributions. That sort of speculation pops up ahead of every budget, every autumn statement, every public spending announcement, and it wasn't apparent today either. So as I said, I think we've got to wait until next year before we see changes to tax policy, before we see the Treasury starting to claw back some of this money they're spending. A lot of this money they're spending an awful lot. That does have to be repaid at some point in the future. But for now, the money is cheap, the borrowing is cheap. It's incredibly cheap for the Treasury to borrow this money, to spend, to invest. So that will continue for some time. What did you think of the Chancellor's public spending review announced today, along with all of these headlines? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please do press the subscribe button so you get more videos from this channel in the future. And remember to like this video too. Until next time, I'm Martin Bamford. And when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow.